Dita, did you want to share the slides and get us started?
Yes. Uh, okay. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's time we can start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the working group session at IETF 110. Um, so, do we have a note taker, Nancy?
We do not.
Uh, so, any volunteers other than the presenters?
We need at least one note taker. The Cody D is up and going. We can't really get the session going unless we have one volunteer.
Hi, Nancy. It's Robin here. I volunteer.
Great.
Perfect.
Thank you. So, Notel applies for this working group session as well. And that's the agenda. We have a very straightforward agenda for this, that we will go over the architecture and transport protocol for first 10 minutes, then the hackathon report. And the rest of the session is for Dave to go over the Teep protocol changes. And I think the protocol is, I've seen it really coming to a great length in the next revision, and seems like we are very close. Any agenda that needs to be discussed? Are you guys okay with this agenda? Do you have any suggestions?
The only question that I have is, since I'm not talking about the two suit issues. Okay, so Akira says he's going to cover it in hackathon. All right, great, thanks.
Okay. Okay, I guess then we can go over the first agenda, which is the architecture one. So Dave.
So these first two should be pretty quick. I'll be talking about the draft architecture 14. Next slide. All right, so just as a recap of where we are, we went through a working group last call. At IETF 109, we discussed any of the issues raised, or the last of the issues raised, I should say, because we discussed them at most of them at previous IETFs. So at IETF number 109, I'm getting some blinking on my screen. I don't know if other people are from Tiro's. It's blinking on and off. Weird. Anyway, draft 14 posted the resolutions from the IETF 109 meeting. And so in particular, the three things that we discussed at IETF 109 that's fixed in there is we had a discussion about how you indicate that you no longer need a TA, and so we added that unrequest TA conceptual API that we discussed at 109. There was a paragraph implicitly talking about secure domains that we talked about removing, and then we removed that. And then finally, there was some discussion about applicability text. And so if you remember at 109, we had a sort of a rush session because we only met for an hour, and then we had a side meeting also. And so some of these were discussed in a side meeting, but I'm not sure that any of those were contentious, but feel free to check. But I think most of the people that cared were actually at that side meeting. So, and then it's been on the list, and so I hope we're good there. There was an open pull request. I think it's been merged now as trivial editorial. There was a typo, and in particular, the glossary, one entry in the glossary was out of order, and so that just fixes that. And so my belief is that the doc is ready to go to the IESG, whatever the shepherd directs. In particular, we would need to post a draft 15 because there's been a pull request or two, that one right there that's been merged. And so I don't know if the document shepherd has any other changes. So I guess my question is to the chairs is, have we done a doc shepherd review yet? And whether we're expecting to have any other changes come in from doc shepherd review.
So Dave, I just reviewed the diff between the previous version and this version. I would like to do a one complete review of the draft once, and probably in the next 1 or 2 weeks I will do the shepherd write-up. I'll post my comments first and then do a shepherd write-up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So I will wait to post draft 15 until after you've done the review. That way, if you find anything, then I will put that in a draft 15 along with that pull request 219. But since that one is just ordering, it doesn't actually change the text other than fixing a typo, that shouldn't affect your Doc Shepherd review.
Yep.
Okay. Next, I don't know if I have any other slides on this one. I think that might be the only one.
Yeah, I
Let's
think we're
check.
good with respect to this
Okay.
one. Yeah.
All right, so now we're going. Oh, and by the way, just the last thing on that one, as I think Akira will talk about, we think that the protocol spec is now stable enough that we don't think that there will be any future changes needed to the architecture document, because now that we have fairly complete-ish implementation of the protocol, we think we've got all the stuff covered in the architecture. So that needs to be in the architecture, and everything else can just be in protocol as any changes happen. All right. So now we're going to move on to the transport, which is the layer underneath the Teep protocol, how you bind the Teep protocol to HTTP in the case where the agent connects to the TAM. So here the timeline. We also had a working group last call early last year, which had some reviews. We solicited additional reviews after that then we discussed at IETF 108. And then IETF 109, we had the last issue that was discussed, which had to do with that, adding the unrequest TA that affected all the documents. And so the changes in draft 10 here is we added the unrequest TA for consistency with both the other documents being added. And then finally, there was an issue that I will talk about on the next slide. So let's just go on to the next slide. So this is already in draft 10. Go ahead. All right. So here is the issue. The architecture document explains that a Teep agent may need to talk to multiple TAMs, right? One example use case that's talked about in the architecture document is where the TA is on one TAM and the personalization data needed for that TA is on a different TAM, okay? That's one of many cases, right? And so the problem was the transport spec had language shown there that previously implied that the agent only had one TAM, right? Because it says when periodically you call this request policy check to see if something has changed in the TAM's policy, and when that happens, you call into the agent from the broker, and the agent either returns a TAM URI to connect to, or passes back a message in TAM URI. So the A implied that, well, of course, that only means one TAM. So how do you support multiple TAMs? How does that work? So that was the issue. Okay. So the resolution was the text at the bottom was then added, which explains that you can talk to multiple TAMs, and the way that happens is that the broker keeps calling request policy check one by one until the agent says nothing to do. Okay. So each call passes back another TAM URI to do with the intent that the broker will then call a request policy check again. So it iterates through these. Whether it does those in series or whether it does those in parallel is up to the implementation. The point is, if you pass back one, it means please call again. So that was the resolution, and that same change was made in the protocol document. So that explains that the previous text was in fact correct. You just need more elaboration to explain how it actually worked. And so that's the resolution on this one. I believe that's it for this document, unless there's any questions. Here, just confirm that is, yeah, that's the last slide. So
Yeah, that's the last slide. Yeah.
questions. Okay. So that was the only technical change, which was a clarification that was necessary in both this document and the protocol document. So, and that one was a result of running into an implementation of the Teep protocol when trying to implement multiple TAMs. So. All right, so I think that's it for these, unless there's any questions.
Any comments? I think this document is almost ready, but I think we'll wait for the protocol draft to progress along with this.
Sure, it might be useful to get a Doc Shepherd review on this one too,
Okay.
just in case there's any issue that whether you or Nancy or Doc Shepherd or somebody else. So.
Sure, we'll figure that out. Yeah, let's first get the architecture out, and then we'll work on this one. Yeah. Akira, you're up next.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. No, not this. Yes. I'm going to talk about hackathon, and when I made the title, I wrote it as a Teep hackathon, but it's uh, more becoming similar to Teep and Suit hackathon, which I will explain later in the slide. Yes. Next, please. And I should have been announcing what time we will get together at the Gather. Yes, it was in Japan time from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. And we were sitting at the table E, a comfortable chair. And yeah, okay. And next page, please. And yes, the objective was bombarding all the pieces inside the Teep protocol draft, and also we are implementing on top of the over HTTP draft. So go through all the cases inside the draft, and anything was trying to purify the documentation and spec from the implementation perspective. And implementation was from two TAM, one from TAM Proto by implementation from Secom. It's open source on GitHub. TAM host by Dave in his GitHub from Microsoft. And Teep device is it's in our project we call it Teep device, but it's Teep client. It's not an open source, but we're using this for testing the draft right now. And the Teep agent from Teep agent TA from Microsoft, and Teep library. It's implemented by Secom. It's more like a helper library for implementing Teep agent and Teep broker, and it's called libcteep. And that's page 4. And could you skip to page 10? And
10? Yeah.
Page 10. Yes, page 10. Page 10 is a summary. I just wanted to explain the summary first to make it easier to understand what we were doing. And after the hackathon, I'm not sure about everybody, but we pretty much feel it's the draft of the Teep protocol and Teep over HTTP protocol is pretty much reasonable. And I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying it's optimal or best, but it's reasonable. It works okay. Yes. And it doesn't mean it's okay to implement in Teep, and it will work. We don't have anything else. It's perfectly working. We still need to work on it's right here. It's until from IETF 110 to 111. Probably they have to test suit manifest in the implementation. And also, we only have tried mostly on the Seaboard implementation without the encryption and decryption and signature verification. So we need to try COSE. And also, we need to start integrating RADS stuff. And it's going to be in the Davis slide today. Okay. So could you go back to page 7?
Sure.
Yeah, thanks. So first thing we were trying to do in the test and verify in the hackathon was token. The type was changed in the Seaboard expression from type of U into B string or binary string. The reason is trying to use the same bytes, which is from between 8 to 64 bytes, as the same in the RADS EAT documentation. So we had to, and then that requires the implementation changes, and it worked fine. Didn't have any much problem. And one thing we couldn't really finish it in the hackathon was creating the suit manifest we initially was using pre-made suit manifest, which is uploaded on suit GitHub, and we didn't generate it. We never generated by ourselves. So we were trying to make generating the suit manifest and then upload it to the TAM server and then using it from TAM client. Yes, we couldn't finish it, but it's okay. It's we got it. We got most of the other stuff done with the pre-created suit manifest. And the next was unneeded TC list was added at IETF 109, and we never finished entire procedure from downloading TC, trusted component, which used to be called trusted application, and install it and run it and delete it, and to all one path. So, and for that purpose, unneeded TC list was added. However, yes, and we were able to finally verify its work and our implementation. Just the minor thing is, yeah, unneeded TC list the feature has became already obsolete in the latest draft. The feature of unneeded TC list for specifying deleting TC is moved to specify in the latest draft is moved to specifying inside the suit manifest, and which is reasonable. And yes, and the last thing is there's this all the Teep message is in suit manifest is too is it's written in CBOR, and every entry it should verify each entry in the CBOR entry. However, we really didn't. We could. Yes, it's not easy to make adding all the checking inside. But we will try as a step by step. Yes. And next page, please. Yes. And yes, this is some of the activity we note during the day we made on the GitHub pull request and adding the issues. It's not an issue. It's more like asking question or asking a comment. But on GitHub, it's only the way it's called is issue. So that's listed here. So first two is it's not really big changes. To make the implementation easier, we have a CDDL example of the CBOR expression and also binary expression representation inside the Teep draft. And some of the example was using 8-byte, and some of the ID component ID was using 15-byte because of my old typo. And so we finally used the size which is reasonable, change it to reasonable, and a little bit of a typo fixing. And yes, while we were reading the documentation implementing during the hackathon, yes, I realized that the word was in the Teep draft was TA signer, and the architecture draft was TC signer. So yes, I just wrote that in the GitHub, and yes, and this is next one is going to be talk in the Dave slide is talk about the token. Should we initially it was we only had token and the Teep message protocol, but it's how we're going to use it between token and the ETH claim set, and also like another discussion was expiration time, or in those discussion will be in the Dave talk. And next is yes, issue 120 is not really draft or any protocol issue. It's we were using pre-generated suit file, suit manifest, and there is a tool, suit suit manifest generator, but we couldn't come up with how to make generating a suit manifest for the deleting. So that's, we wanted to have a example, then we could put it in, whether, I'm not sure what it's going to be, it should be in the Teep draft or suit draft, but yes, and we would like to have the CDDO expression example and binary representation, so it will make it easier for the people who's going to implement this from the draft. And yes, and this is next era query request is, this is from Dave. And so one of the discussion during the hackathon was, I didn't have a time to add it in the GitHub, is there's a sequence number in the suit manifest, and there's a version number of the trusted component inside the suit manifest, and how to handle rollback. And we didn't get to the conclusion. So if we get to have a little bit more idea, I will put it in the GitHub. And the next one is page 9, 2 issue related to specifying URI for the suit manifest binary. And I add that into the last slide. So could you go to page 11? Okay. So first question is, it's not a question, but one of the usage of the suit manifest binary inside the Teep is, there's a TC signer who is developing a TC, which is include application or the personal data or a serial number or license key, and that will be encapsulated in the suit manifest binary, and then it will be encapsulated in the Teep message, and that will be handed over to the TAM vendor. It's very likely to have some of the TC signer is independently developing the TC binary and handing over to the TAM vendor, which is something like App Store or TAM server hosted by a security company or insurance company or any other company, and they would like to host the binary by their self. Then we need to override or specify externally the URI information where the TAM's TC binary is to download. And one of the idea is that the valid use cases, and it was the 104 is the question, asking the question is 104, and 105 is how to describe that in suit manifest. And I think I need an expert from suit joining today. Should we add URI section, override section, externally from where a section of the signed by TC signer, or should we make a encapsulated suit I forgot envelope, I forgot the wording, but encapsulating portion which is suit written by signed by TC signer, and then adding a URI information with the override and encapsulating again with the TAM vendor. We just want to have the which way is the preferred way with the suit, and we would like to have we would like to add it to the CDDL expression and binary representation in the draft. And Brandon, do you mind comment?
Absolutely, I was biding my
Yes.
time.
Okay.
So the first question that you've got here, I think that all of the questions that you asked, no, there's one in addition to the 3 on this page. So I'll start with the one that's not on the page. You asked about rollback specifically. So when you have a component with a version number test that's embedded in the manifest, and you also have a sequence number, the version number tests that you apply should apply regardless of what version you're installing. The manifest was not intended to assert version numbers. It was intended to determine whether or not a component is installable. So the idea here is that if you want to install an older version on purpose, what you need is a more advanced sequence number in the manifest. And then the system will still verify all of the checks that you put in your manifest. But the idea here is that using a larger sequence number shows the intent to install an older payload. And it's about communicating the intent accurately. So that's the idea there.
Okay. Then we should follow. Yes. So then we should use the sequence number for the distinguish which rollback or whatever we should override with the existing TA binary. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So if you want to force a downgrade, then re-signing a manifest that's identical except for having its version or its sequence number incremented is the right answer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So the next one, there is a mechanism in suit to deliver an overridden URI. So that absolutely is a valid use case. The way that you do it is you make a secondary manifest that links the first one as a dependency, and it asserts one thing, and that is a URI. The rest of its operations are simply pass-throughs to the existing manifest. Okay.
Yes. In that case, is the construction of the suit manifest binary? Is it going to be encapsulating the existing suit manifest with additional URI manifest, and then signed by TAM's vendor?
So the intent was that these could have a separation of responsibility, so that one could be signed by the TAM, the TAM's authority, and the second could be signed by even local independent infrastructure. The idea there is that it still should be something that the device trusts, but it doesn't have to be the TAM.
I see. Then the manifest construction will be having side by side signed by different signer.
That's correct. You do also have the option of embedding one manifest inside another one, and particularly if you want to encrypt a manifest, there's some discussion about encrypted manifests going on in the chat, then this becomes relevant because embedding it in the cleanest way of dealing with the encrypted manifest is to take a manifest that contains nothing but the encryption information and potentially an overridden URI, and then reference a manifest that's encrypted that is also contained in the external metadata of that first manifest. Yeah, so that's an option as well.
All right. Thank you.
Then the last one, generating a manifest for delete, that's a hot topic, and we are figuring that one out. The best answer I've been able to come up with so far is that delete is probably not what we want, because it's going to introduce a situation where if you have two components that both depend on a tertiary component, and one of them has a manifest that says delete that tertiary component, then you end up breaking the dependency chain of another TC. So you probably
Yes.
don't actually want delete. So my suggestion is that we use an unlink or a garbage collect semantic, so that you effectively decrease the reference count of the component that you're trying to delete, and if its reference count hits 0, then you delete it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Either is not easy, but yeah. Okay. Yes. Okay. And can I ask the additional question for the first rollback question? Yes. It's we were thinking when we're trying to handle sequence number and the Teep agent, it might have the two suit manifest binary. One is for one for TCA. TCA is updating current installed TCA inside the device, and another suit manifest binary containing TCB, which is not installed already. And both will, and the suit manifest says to handle based first with the suit sequence number before handling anything inside. And how to bind, do we need to care which sequence, the sequence number should be binded to which TC? And the implementation was the, yes, something additional question came up.
I think you do have to care. And the problem is one of authority. So we don't want an authority inversion. If you have three TCs in a dependency tree, and they're each signed by different authorities, then you don't want to use the top level sequence number as the sequence number for all of them. And the reason that this is such an important consideration is because that would effectively give the top level authority rollback authority over all components that were referenced in its dependency tree. And if you expand that in a system that allows components in general like this, then that could be expanded even further to say that you end up with rollback authority over any component, because all you have to do is link it as a dependency and then set a different sequence number. So,
and yes, then what will be good way in the Teep agent to binding between the different TC binary with the sequence number with it, because the component ID is inside the manifest and manifest body. So, or should we use Teep agent use some kind of ID for the different sequence number?
the sequence number is also inside the manifest body.
Oh, I see. So
it is the second element.
I see. So then it's okay to matching. Binding the component ID with the sequence number inside the manifest body.
Yes,
and
that should
use
be
it
fine.
and using that as the I see. Okay. Yes. Okay. Let's. I probably for the next before the next hackathon. Yes, we will try with the that implementation. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that's all in the most important topics in the slide. Yes.
That's great, Akira. Thanks.
Thank you.
Dave, you're up
So-
next.
Yeah, so let's take a pause here for a couple of minutes. So there's some questions in the chat with respect to the discussions that have just been happening with respect to suit between Akira and Brendan, but Hannes also raised the question as to whether these discussion topics some of those clarifications and descriptions, whether they belong in Teep or suit or both. So Hannes, I don't know, or Dave, I don't know if you wanted to more publicly express that here. We've got a few minutes
Okay.
that we discussed.
Yeah, so the issues 104 and 105 being the ones that I think were on that last slide that we were just talking about, I think are actually questions about, how do I use the suit manifest? And so those are ones that in the actual issues I'd commented saying, I think these are just questions for suit, not about Teep. And so I don't think that there's anything that I saw yet anyway that necessitated a change in the Teep document. And that's why the discussion with Brendan, as long as Brendan says it's already covered or whatever, then we either close them, or at most there might be some place in the document that we can add a deep reference into a particular section of the suit manifest spec, if there's some place that would be appropriate. But in other words, I'm answering your question saying I think they're suit topics, but I think they're suit topics that my understanding is Brendan has answered them by saying they're not work for suit. They're things that suit has already done, and it's just making sure that there's understanding and links into the correct sections if that's appropriate. So, yeah, so 104 and 105 there, that's what was on that last slide that we were talking through, slide, I don't know, 11 or whatever in Akira's.
Dave, Robin here. Just for the notes for clarity. So, do you think that those clarifications should be reflected in any of the Teep documents?
I am open to others' opinion on that, but so far I'm not sure that I've seen anything that needs a change to the Teep document. But Akira is also an editor in the Teep protocol document. If Akira says, "Hey, there's a particular place in the Teep protocol document that would make sense to have a deep reference, and it's linked to a specific section of that," that would be fine. But I'm not aware of anything right now. But I would be open to that if somebody else generates a pull request.
Great, thank you.
My thought is I don't think it's anything related in the Teep protocol draft. It's just initially the reason I filed the issue in the Teep protocol GitHub is I thought it would be a good way to add the suit manifest example in the binary representation CDDO example section in the Teep draft. That's all. And closing this in the Teep GitHub and then moving to the suit GitHub is absolutely no problem.
Yeah, I think the only one of these three issues here that there might be able to be a deep reference is the bottom one. So, for example, where in the query response, right, that's when you have the list of unneeded TAs. And then, of course, the actual action happens in the update message inside the suit manifest. And then so in the field description of unneeded TAs in the query response, or the processing rules for that, that it might be possible, if it's not in there already, to have a deep reference into the suit manifest spec section that talks about the delete or the unlink command, whatever it gets called. So that's an example of where in 128 at the bottom, we might have a deep reference there. But for 104 and 105, I can't think of a case. So
That's fair. Tom, you're in the queue.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. So about I had a couple of questions for Akira about this hackathon presentation, but I don't know if it's the right time now, or just want to postpone those. Is it okay?
Now's the right time because we're ready to move on.
Okay, so this is from a RATS/implementer angle, and so the questions are any of the implementation that you referenced in the slides open source, and if so, would it be possible to have links to the source code, or I don't know if it's in GitHub or whatever? And
yes.
Okay, so they're all open source?
Not all.
Okay.
Yes.
Could you
do you mind going to the first page 4?
Sure.
So yes,
That's not
I
right.
should have add the link here. The one only it's not open source is our Teep device, the third one. But the first one,
Okay.
second, and fourth and fifth, it's there's a link to the GitHub.
Okay,
Yes.
excellent. So I go on
Mhm.
and see this. And does any of these implements the Teep evidence? And if so, which one? I'm asking because I would like to provide a verifier for that, and would like to do some interop as well. In fact, it'd be super nice if we could organize something together at next hackathon around that.
First one, and yeah, in our implementation, we haven't got to that point.
Okay.
Dave, does it have it in your implementation? Dave?
Mine includes the evidence fields, but I have not implemented the EAT stuff yet.
Oh.
And so it's basically I have stubs that's there for plugging it in. And so that's why on your slide, Akira, you mentioned that, next hackathon or whatever, we want to play around with implementing and integrating the rat stuff. And so that's accurate for me as well.
Okay,
and so I
excellent.
hadn't done that before just because the EAT spec was undergoing various changes and things. And so that's why we're concentrating on the suit integration first, because the spec was more stable than the EAT spec. So it's just a sequencing.
Okay, excellent. Good news. So I'll see you at the next hackathon then. Can play around.
Akira, maybe you can post the GitHub links on the mailing list for
okay.
people
Yeah,
to
that
have a
would be
look.
nice
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, I think we can move on then.
Okay.
Saw in chat that Hannah said that you had he had slides on his hackathon stuff, and so I'm wondering if the chairs would want to allow Hannah to come in to complete the hackathon discussion before me.
Oh, I didn't notice that on the chat. Kohei also just posted the GitHub.
Yeah, so earlier, Hannah, you'd posted a URL to hackathon slides from you.
Yeah, but I think it's also fine to cover this during the suit meeting if there is time, because I would
the
like to
problem is
include.
Suit only has an hour and Teep has 2 hours, and so we actually have far more time in this meeting than in the suit meeting. I say as a suit chair.
Oh, okay. Yeah, why not?
So the only question is, you really will? Okay. So Hannes, maybe 5-10 minutes at the most.
Okay.
But we don't have your slides unless Didu, you saw them.
I can.
No, I haven't seen the slides, so I think Hans can share the screen and present the slides if it's okay with him.
Yeah.
Of course.
At least the link is in the chat, so everybody else that's out there can download the slides themselves without looking at the proceedings. But I have not seen
Well,
them,
we should put it in the proceedings too, but I'm not seeing it in the chat.
Hannah's posted them. You got to scroll up to 41404, Nancy.
All right, thanks.
But I can just present them, requested the presentation rights.
Yep.
Oh.
But I think you guys need to.
I'm just giving that. Yeah, it's going to take some time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've given you the permission.
Okay. Not seeing anything.
Or maybe I should stop sharing the screen. Okay, now check.
Let me try it again.
Yeah, you're the only one with the permission.
Okay, but I think I should get a pop-up that says, "Hey, can I present?"
Yes. Yes, you should get a pop-up.
Yeah, don't see a pop-up,
Yeah.
Maybe you can show the slide. Ah, yes. Now it's here.
Okay.
I hope you can see it.
Yes.
Okay, I try to hurry up. Yeah, so I was specifically focusing on the encryption functionality because that was one topic that was initially in OTRP because of this personalization data that was encrypted. And then in Suit, we also had the requirement to encrypt firmware images themselves. And the spec, the Suit spec points to COSA, and of course the Teep spec points to Suit for that matter. And but we don't have any examples in there, and so I wanted to, as part of this exercise, to just create a few real examples. And so I used Lawrence's presentation, QCBOR. All the CBOR implementations are a little bit different, so it's not so easy to interchange them. You basically have to do a rewrite. And also for the crypto, I've used the BSA crypto API, which I linked in the slide deck. But unfortunately, it doesn't implement the key wrap, which is needed by the COSI spec. So I had to also fold in embed DLS. So there was maybe more code than I had hoped. And I wanted to integrate it ultimately in MCU boot with the libc suit that was mentioned earlier as an implementation. So I think the important part of what I learned from doing this, besides getting examples, is that I believe the suit manifest specification needs some extra details to make it easier for developers, and also to restrict the number of options, because we have paid a lot of attention to keep the manifest size very small. But by just referencing the COSI spec for this functionality, you basically blow out all the benefits of this optimization out of the window, because the COSI spec has so many options, it's unbelievable. And some of them, in my opinion, don't make a lot of sense for our use cases. And maybe there's in the future, there's other kind of profiles for other use cases that we haven't envisioned. So I focused on two features. One was a classical AES key wrap with a symmetric key. So what it essentially does is, and I should have included the example keyboard diagnostic format into the slide deck as well, but I will post it to the mailing list. What it does is it creates a content encryption key, a random content encryption key, and encrypts this content encryption key with the long-term symmetric key that is available, and then the spec, the suit spec, uses it in a detached mode, so the encrypted firmware is not included in the COSI in the COSI structure, so it's separate. So I think that's also one aspect. And yeah, so that was for the key wrap, and the example is can be then quite sort of simple or small. And then the other functionality I implemented, which is a little bit more complicated, but it's essentially the public key based version. And there are also many options in the COSI spec. And the one that I picked after looking into the MCU boot was I used the elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman ephemeral static mode with the HKDF, which also uses AES key wrap. And so in essence, the entity that creates the firmware image, again in a detached sort of as a standalone, then creates the manifest, which then where this party then creates an ephemeral key pair, and it includes the public key into the manifest, and then uses a key, the HKDF, key derivation function to derive the key that is used to encrypt the content encryption key, like we had before, and that is then used to encrypt the firmware image in detached mode. So it's a little bit convoluted, but I think with the this is with the description, with the added description, and I'm going to prepare a PR on how that text would look like for the meeting, for the SUIT meeting. So I think that will help to make it to have the examples in there and have the text in there so that we implementers get those two modes right. And if someone wants some other modes, of course, feel free to suggest some others. Yeah, I would also like to thank Russ, who helped me with some of the key wrap stuff. And then I had a chat with Ken about his libsuit and Brendan on the cozy stuff. I totally forgot again that we used the detached mode, and I reached out to the MCU boot guys about their capabilities there, because ultimately I wanted to, in this case, I wanted to add the suit to the MCU boot to have sort of equivalent functionality, which allowed me to constrain the number of options to something that is usable also in the MCU boot case. That's all I have. I will send the examples to the list.
Sounds great. Dave, you're in the queue.
Ask, since Hannes, on slide 4, you mentioned that you think clarifications are needed to the suit manifest document. I just want to explicitly ask, are there anything that you think that should change in any of the Teep documents? Obviously, this use case is important because we talk about the requirements in this use case in the architecture document right now. But is there anything that you think would need to be added into, whether it's an example or anything else, in the Teep documents, or do you think that it would only be in suit documents, as far as any text changes you think might come in from your stuff? So
yeah. So previously there was this a comment about adding examples also to the Teep document, and I guess if we add an example, sort of a more complete example with a suit manifest in there, I think it makes also sense to maybe include one that also there's the encryption capability, since it was in OTRP. I think that would make sense.
Okay, got it. All right, so thank you. Because I don't remember if I mentioned this in the next presentation or not, but the Teep protocol document now does have in the appendix a minimal suit manifest in the example, and so it could be augmented there. So, all right, gotcha. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, guys. And Hannes, I'll upload your slides to the Teep materials too.
Okay, so now I think I'm up next, right?
There's one comment on the static Diffie-Hellman. Yeah, I saw that too, and that's why I was confused about what that DLS presentation really did. But that presentation, if I really understood it correctly, was more concerned about specific uses of the Cypher suite, and not so much about these one-shot messages, because there's no possibility to do a the key encryption without actually having a one-shot key encryption with elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman without a static component in there, right? I hope that makes sense.
Okay.
All right, so I think yep. All right, so I'll talk about the changes since 009. This is the actual protocol spec, and so this will be probably the rest of the meeting, or until chair's call time. So, all right. There are things that we discussed at 109, and so a bunch of the changes were things we discussed at 109. So here's a list of things we discussed at 109 that are now done in the spec. So we combined the install and delete message into one common update message, so you can do both installs and deletes in the same message. even in the same suit manifest. We made the token be absent when it's redundant. So, for example, if you're using attestation and you are getting all of the matching and nonces and stuff in the evidence, then you don't need it outside the evidence in the query response. So now the token is only present when it's not already redundant with something else. The cipher suites we talked about are now, both of them are mandatory to implement on the TAM, and both are optional on the agent. And we use the suit component identifier as the trusted component ID. So all those things are things that we resolve at 109 in the meeting discussion. People can go back to the minutes and recordings and stuff there, but those are all accomplished as we discussed them. We then discussed something that was kind of open going into 109, which then Akira referred to, which is the suit manifest is now used to delete components. And so that's what Akira was mentioning, that we removed the ability in the update message to explicitly specify component IDs to delete, because that's now inside the suit manifest. So that was also done in this draft. So next slide. All right, and then some things that we'll talk about in later slides here, 1, 2, and 3 that I'll drill down into. But 4, 5, and 6 I'll just cover here. So Akira proposed and we accepted adding maximum sizes to various integer fields to make it easier for constrained implementations to know how big of a buffer to use or to have for, say, integer fields and things. Integer fields and even token and so on have a maximum size there. Prior to this version of the spec, a bunch of the things showed up in messages, but did not have any specific text that said what the processing rules of those messages are, and that's now explicit in there. You can kind of read into it from the syntax before, but now it's explicit that we now have a place to do that, and we filled in a bunch of that information. And then a bunch of editorial clarifications that are worth presenting because they're all editorial. But the top 3 are ones that we need to discuss, and so I got slides on those 3. So let's talk through those one at a time first. So next slide. Okay, so the issue number 49 was, the architecture document says that for the Teep use cases, that the evidence has to have at least a bunch of the following information in it, or at least capable of having the following information in it. It's up to the implementation whether it actually has a specific piece, but across the use cases, this is the set of things that are needed for the union of them. And so that's the list on the left side, which is the items listed in the Teep architecture document, which of course has been through last call, so we already have consensus on the leftmost column. The rightmost column, you can see the ones that mention draft IETF RATS EAT are the ones that we agreed are already covered in the existing EAT specification. The first 2 that have EAT in them are kind of interesting because there's 2 of the Teep requirements that are actually in the same claim, right? The chip version and scheme has multiple things in it that are like hyphen separated or something like that. So that one meets both requirements. But then all the other ones, besides the 3 that say draft IETF RATS EAT, were not met in the EAT document. And so this is a discussion we had last IETF, I think in like RATS discussion, where Hank, and we had a email discussion right before last IETF that we discussed at IETF, but I don't think it was in the Teep meeting. So that's why I'm reporting stuff out here. So after last IETF, Hank then went and wrote a document that actually did what was discussed on that cross RATS/Teep mailing list discussion. And that's draft Burkholz RATS suit claims, which was also presented briefly in the RATS working group yesterday. And so the claims there in the middle are the ones that show up in the draft Burkholz RATS suit claims in those sections that were added to meet the Teep requirements in a way that is actually not Teep specific. So you can see that's a RATS document, because the conclusion of that thread and the discussion since then is that everything that Teep wants here, all those requirements on the left side, are things that can be done in ways that are not Teep specific. And so that's why there's actually no Teep document here. But what we did in the Teep protocol document was we added basically this table that says, here's the requirements, here is the various claims, and here is the document that you can find them in. So if you look in the Teep protocol spec, you can see how to meet the requirements in the Teep architecture by reference to the 2 RATS documents. And so in rats yesterday, there was a discussion about whether the Burkholz document should be combined into the EAT document or what. And I think EAT is on the agenda for rats in the meeting slot later today. But the point is, we added this table into here, and we'll update the references as the references need to be updated. But we believe the list of claims is now there. All requirements now appear to be met. And of course, since there's a normative dependency, well, there's a normative dependency, that's actually incorrect. I look back at the document, it's informative. Actually, it could go either way, so let me just leave that open right now. So I don't know if there, unless there's any questions, I don't think there's anything else here to talk about, because we'll just track the issue for the RATS document is the draft Burkholz does not actually have the labels. And so it's actually not implemented yet. Because you can't have, what's the seaborne numbers to use for those claim things. So the table is in there, but you can't actually implement it yet, and we would like to be able to get to that before next IETF. And so to answer the question that was asked early in this meeting, were any of the hackathon implementations doing EAT? Answer, no, and this is one of the reasons why is we need those numbers that are in the draft Burkholz one before you can actually do an implementation. So that's why it's pushed to next IETF. All right, unless there's any other questions. I don't know if there's anything in the chat. Nope. All right, let's go to the next slide then. But feel free to jump in the queue if you have questions about rats interaction. Okay, here's the example.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah, this is.
I think Thomas is in the queue.
All right, go ahead, Thomas.
Sorry, my audio dropped off at the critical moment. I'm not sure you said whether the hardware identifiers claim need pre-registration or not.
That, I believe, is a question for the RATS working group rather than the Teep working group. And so I think we will use whatever RATS does.
Okay.
I don't know if there's, I'm not aware of any requirement that we have in either direction from Teep.
Okay. Okay, so it's not critical for you to have pre-registered claims.
I think it's critical that we have a way to meet our use case, and
Okay.
exactly how, I think, it's at least right now, my opinion is we leave that up to the RATS working group.
Okay, cool.
We
Thank you.
sent them a bunch of requirements, right, in the architecture document. And the architecture document, you can read it as not having any requirement in that respect. And so that's why I'm just echoing out. So far, our consensus, we've not had any consensus that there is any requirement there. So I need direction. So.
Right. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So next slide. So 67 is closely related, still related to RATS here. This one was, could we add a sample EAT into the document? Because we talk about sample messages and it says, well, it carries EAT, but of course the content is elided. So can we fill in the content as an example, right? And this is in the appendix for the examples. So we did that. And so this is a sample EAT that actually appears in the appendix right now. And you can see the TBDs in there, which is how they're labeled in the draft Burkholz document. And so that's why you can't implement it yet, because you can't implement the bottom half of this. And so this is a made up example that doesn't match to any real TEE. So that's why you can see the chip version scheme is my TEE. Just you can fill in a dummy GUID for a device and vendor and class and so on. So this is not a realistic one. This is just a hypothetical one with a made up TEE, just to show how the claims can actually fit in and work together. So if we, after implementation, then we might update this example. We could maybe have a real one if we wanted to. But right now, we just want to show that all the claims are met and how it fits into the Teep message. So that was issue 67, which is resolved other than filling in the TBDs, so which we depend on RATS for. And again, all those TBDs are the ones that would be out of the draft Burkholz document currently. If they got merged into EAT, that's fine. But we just need those TBDs. And so in the RATS meeting yesterday, I mentioned early IANA assignment of those numbers would be helpful to unblock the hackathon for Teep. So. All right, unless there's any questions on that, we can go on to the next slide. All right, so this one is one that I ran into, and I proactively merged it, but I do not claim that there's consensus on it yet. So that's why this is open, and I would like to either confirm that I did the right thing, that I have support for this. Otherwise, we have to revert it or do something else, which is okay, because this is still open. Okay. So the issue is as follows. The error messages have an integer error code, and they have an optional text message, right? This has always been the case since the draft 0. Draft 04 had a bunch of error codes, and it had an IANA registry for the error codes. Draft 05 makes the following proposal. Okay. New error codes, I'm just going to read this because this is the important part here, because these bullets here are actually quotes out of the actual Draft 05. New error code should be added sparingly, not for every implementation error. That's the intent of the error message field. That's that text message, which can be used to provide details meaningful to humans, right? So it's saying, don't add a new error code just because you have a different text message, right? Just because you have something new that is meant for a human. The use of integers, you don't add new integers just for humans, right? New error code should only be added if the TAM is expected to do something behaviorally different upon receipt of the error message, rather than just logging the event. Hence, each error code is responsible for saying what the behavioral difference is expected to be. Okay, so in other words, the proposal is use integers if you actually expect them to show up in a switch statement on the TAM or equivalent, right? Or jump table or whatever, right? And use error messages if you have things that are meant to be different for humans, right? So you can overload the same error number if you get the same behavior and just have different text messages. That's fine, right? You don't need a new error code number unless you have a different entry in a switch or jump table, right? And as a result, each error code that would be added would be responsible for saying an example of what the behavioral difference is expected to be. I got an example on the next slide. So that's the new text that appears in Draft 05. Whether people like it or not, we can update it. Now, the result of this, the implication is that since adding an error code implies adding statements about behavioral difference, and the protocol behavior is protocol spec, then the IANA registry text is removed. Okay, that's the potentially more contentious thing that I want to call out. It says that's why, and it's because the rule proposed is that in order to add one, that you got to say what the behavioral difference would be, and therefore that would be more like an RFC required rather than an IANA request. Okay, and so as a result, that rule also resulted in reducing the number of error codes because a couple of them collapsed because the behavior would have been approximately the same, or would be the same, and we had example behavioral differences. So let's look at the next slide. So that's what you can use to actually evaluate. Go to the next slide. All right. So this is trying to make it fit on one slide. So I've removed redundant words by putting up at the top and say, so a TAM receiving this error might, right? This is informative, not normative, to show an example because the actual implementation behavior is up to the implementation. But to motivate why two things are different, right? Then there's different example behaviors. You can look at it and says, well, yeah, I guess it is a pretty different behavior than the other ones. And so, yeah, I think that makes sense to have that many different things because there's that many possible behaviors. And so here's some examples, right? Stop trying for some long time, right? For example, you don't support a common version or something like that. So, it doesn't matter if I'm going to resend unless the other side has been updated, then there's no point. We're not going to communicate. That would be an example of permanent error. Retry without using extensions if you find that there's an unsupported extension. Retry using a different version if there's a mismatch in the message version. Retry using a different crypto algorithm if you get a crypto algorithm not supported because you have multiple of them that you can support. You just try it with a different one. Bad certificate. If you got multiple certificates, you can try a different certificate. Certificate expired, well, you might kick off a procedure to do a renewal or something before using it again, thinking, well, okay, maybe your times aren't quite in sync and he thinks it expires, 5 minutes before me, and oh, look, it's getting close to when I would normally renew it. I don't know, something like that. So temporary error might be something like out of memory, and so I might want to retry after some short time because just because he hit an error now doesn't mean he's going to hit an error next time. And then the last one is manifest processing failed. So something was bad inside a particular suit manifest, like it couldn't do some command or trying to do that command hit some error or something else. But that might not prevent me from trying to install or update other components with other suit manifests, right? So all those are distinctly different behaviors. And so all those make perfect sense as having a distinctly different error code, because you could easily imagine an implementation that has a switch statement or jump table that has different handlers for each of those and triggers a particular action in code in the TAM. Okay. Now, maybe there's some other ones you can think of, but there was a longer set in draft 04 that I collapsed into exactly this list. So there's a couple things that were collapsed into permanent error and a couple things that were collapsed into temporary error, for example. But if there's other ones, we'd be happy to add them, but I want people to understand this is the proposed rule for how to do that and to use text error messages for things that are only differences for humans or for logs. And so that's the one that I wanted to actually verify we're going in the right direction in the document right now, since we didn't talk about this before. It was just in a GitHub issue. So I will pause in case anybody wants to jump into the queue, but otherwise, if I don't see anybody jumping into queue, I will continue. All right, I see Robin Wilton jumping into queue.
Hi, Dave. Yes, Robin. And I have to say, from ISOC, but not speaking for ISOC. Yeah, so are you going to give corresponding examples of an error code that might have an error code that does not justify sufficiently different protocol behavior and therefore is only distinguishable through the human message? In other words, the other half.
I was not.
Okay.
But if you want one, the easiest way to get that, maybe one of the other Teep protocol editors can look in GitHub issue 51, or sorry, and go to the pull request and look at the pull request and see, because I can't remember which ones were deleted. Like I said, the easiest way is I think there was at least 2 that were combined into permanent error and at least 2 that were combined into temporary error. And I can't remember that looking back at the GitHub pull request.
No problem. Yeah, no, it wasn't so much for me. It was for anyone reading the document to have an example of.
Oh, okay, I see. I understand your question. You weren't asking about in the slides. You're asking about in the doc.
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
You know, if you're going to give examples of one, friendly to give example of the other, I guess.
Yeah. So temporary error and permanent error are ones that are the easiest to say. And here's a couple of cases that might result in this. Yeah.
Cool. Great. Thank you.
So I'd say maybe temporary error. I can think of 2 cases maybe right off the top of my head now. One case is where there was a memory allocation failure, and so the agent fills in, temporary error. And another case might be where there's some component that some resource other than memory, maybe it's disk space, where the agent needs access to disk space or secure storage or something like that and can't get it or it's not currently available. So there's 2 different resources that it needs between memory and storage, and it can't get one or the other, and both of those resolve to temporary error.
Great.
And
cool.
So you add
Thank you.
a third resource that you depend on, and that one might have temporary unavailability, and so you reuse the same error.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dave. Now all I have to do is resolve the challenge of note-taking and asking questions. That'll teach me not to ask questions when note-taking. Thanks.
But we want you to do both, Robin. So don't stop taking notes. Don't stop asking questions. All right. Next slide then, unless there's anybody else. All right, now I'm watching the queue thing, not the chat thing. Sorry. So chairs will have to interrupt me if there's anything in chat for me. So, all right. So the next issue, and this one, now we're getting into ones that are not in the current draft. These are in GitHub, but not any text that's been put into the document yet. So this is one that we ran into during hackathon implementation and trying to figure out what to do about it. And so currently I have implemented what the draft says, which is not great. So the issue comes up when you have errors processing the query request. And so if you think about the things we just talked about, unsupported message version, unsupported crypto algorithm, and so on. So let's talk about unsupported message version. Okay, this is kind of interesting because the document has had this error code in it since the beginning. So you think about when would you hit this error? Okay, well, you'd hit it certainly in processing a query request. Okay, you can hit it in processing an update message. And previously, the document says that you can only ever send an error message in response to an update message. Okay, so that means this error code could only be sent if you hit this in the error message. Okay, if you hit this in the update message. But when do you get an update message? You get an update message after sending a query response. How do you send a query response? By processing a query request. How do you process the query request? Answer, you can't. So that means this is basically an error code that there's no way to possibly hit in a normal implementation in the current spec. That's the issue, okay? And so what do you do when you hit an error like unsupported message in the query request? What the document says right now is you drop it. You do nothing. So there's no way to send an error message. There's no way to communicate that you have an unsupported message version. That's the issue that's in the document right now. So the question is, what do we do about that? Okay. So a couple of options we could do. Number one, we could allow an error to be sent in response to a query request, right? That would be my preference. Number two, we could do what the draft says right now, which is to silently drop the query request. In other words, the TAM never gets any feedback whatsoever that there's a message version mismatch. And that makes it really hard to debug things. And so for us as hackathon developers, I would prefer not that one, which is what the draft says right now. Number three is, well, we could copy it into the query response. It says you send a query response, but you'd have the extra error fields in there. We could do that one. That just seems like it's extra duplication for no real benefit. And so that's why my proposal is we go with number one, which is we change the spec to allow the existing error message, the existing error message to be sent in response to a query request. Now, one thing to keep in mind, though, is if it is in particular the unsupported message version, you might be sending an older error message version to the TAM, and we just have to be able to deal with that. But that, I think, is the preferable option out of these three, and I couldn't think of a fourth option. So my proposal is to go forward with option one in the next version of the document, and I would update that in my implementation, which would be very easy to do. But I am open to feedback if people think that's the wrong direction. Pausing in case anybody wants to jump into the queue. Yeah, certainly from other hackathon people, did you run into this, and what do you do with your implementation? So I see Akira is in queue. So.
Yeah, I'm fine either one or three, if it's not second.
But not two, right?
Yeah, not two, not two.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Again, my preference for one is because there's far less spec work and less duplication in code, right? Because now my message composer on the agent side and message parsers on the TAM side only need to look for error codes in one place and not two, and that's why one is simpler to implement. All right. Hearing no objections, I will claim that that people would be okay with us putting option one into the next version of the draft. So great, let's go on. Next slide. All right, Russ Housley sent a review about Cypher suites. And so the top half of the slide is what's in the document right now. There's two Cypher suites. You can see those two there. Those are the two that are both mandatory to implement on the TAM, and you can pick or choose on the agent. And right above that, not shown here, is the direction that says, here's the table, and an algorithm is required that has an HMAC. And he says, I think future Cypher suite should allow MAC algorithms other than HMAC, such as GMAC. So just change HMAC to MAC. And there he's not talking about the table. He's talking about that text that's right above the table that says the algorithms need a MAC algorithm. And so I've done that in a pull request, but it's not in the document to just make that change that says future ones need a MAC. It doesn't have to specifically say that the future ones would need an HMAC in particular. So. But the open question here that I would like the feedback on, that it's not in any pull request now, that we just need a decision on, so I know what to put in the text. So in section 9, which is the under consideration section, please say whether future registrations, so whether additions to this table should allow integrity without confidentiality in Cypher suites. And so we should just pick one now, and I see Russ is in queue, so we can elaborate. So go ahead, Russ.
So we've seen in other working groups that if we don't say what the rules are up front, then the IANA expert has to decide what was meant. Whereas if we put it in the document, whether we can have integrity without confidentiality or not now, then the IANA expert can enforce the working group's consensus and not have a big head scratch moment. So I would just like to sort it out now so we don't end up in this position going forward.
Yep, And I put it on my slides here because I want whatever the recommendation is for the working group to be minuted. So since I don't know, does somebody else have a proposal for which direction would be the answer? So whether integrity without confidentiality should be allowed or disallowed? I don't know, is Ming on here? I don't know if you have any, I guess Ming isn't on here. So Hannes, do you have any opinion?
No, I don't right now. No.
Hey Dave, I have a comment. I see a lot of the messages being exchanged with the TAM and Teep agent carry a lot of AI data, like the device identifier, the kind of trusted applications that get installed, and it has a big serious privacy impact if it's sent in clear text. So unless there's a justification how that is not going to identify a specific user's device, or it's not going to hamper someone's privacy, sure, we can go with integrity, but I see a lot of sensitive data being exchanged, and I don't see a reason why we should degrade someone's privacy by not allowing confidentiality at this time.
Just to be clear, I'm not advocating that we don't allow confidentiality. I'm advocating whether we mandate confidentiality.
Yeah, I see a question in chat from Jonathan Hamill, which is a reasonable question about implying I don't have a preference until I know what the Mac is used for. So I'm wondering, Hannes, can you summarize what the Mac is used for? Since you can probably do it more succinctly than I can.
That's a good question. Actually, at the moment, I don't think we use the Mac for anything. Actually, that's not true. So we have for example, so it depends on what this is used for the messaging, right?
Yeah. Now remember, this is the question is not about whether to allow something without a Mac. The question is whether to allow something without encryption. So Jonathan, I'm just extrapolating from Jonathan's questions. What is the Mac used for? Let me rephrase. Can you summarize what the Cipher suite is used for? Right. This is for encryption, or it's just used for message authentication. I'm just wondering if you can give us that answer. Otherwise, I can try if you don't want to. So.
Yep. Go ahead.
So I think there's one layer that is used to keep track of the integrity of the Teep message. And so separately is the integrity or confidentiality of the component being delivered via Teep, right? That is done by stuff that's inside the suit manifest, okay? Well, that's not what this one is about. This is about the Teep messages themselves. So Hannes, please correct me if I say something wrong. So this is about...
That's correct.
So not about the payload. So let's pretend that you've already got confidentiality of the payload, okay? This is about whether the Teep messages themselves have integrity, which they do, or the Teep messages themselves have confidentiality. And so I think this is equivalent to saying, can the Teep messages have not confidentiality at the Teep message layer? You still have confidentiality at the payload layer. And in theory, you have some confidentiality at the transport layer, although that confidentiality terminates outside the TEE, so it's not end-to-end in the true protocol sense. And so the Teep message would be, if you need to protect the confidentiality of, say, which component IDs that you are installing and uninstalling, would that be confidential information? And in some use cases, the answer is absolutely. Some of the workloads or TAs that you're installing might be person identifiable information, right? If you're installing, health things like, blood pressure monitor things onto a device or whatever, then that can be confidentiality sensitive. I guess the question is, would we want to allow Teep messages in cases where the components being installed and uninstalled and updated, that the categories of them are things that need to have that do not need confidentiality protection, and it would be fine to just use a cipher suite for the Teep messages that does not provide confidentiality of the Teep headers. I think that's the question.
Yes, that's the question. But I think you also have to say whether the things that EAT might expose would be protected separately, as you already explained, the payload is protected by suit.
That is a great point. I think right now in actually some who can speak authoritatively to that? My recollection is that EAT is a JSON web token or CBOR web token, and so it inherits the same answer as JSON web tokens and CBOR web tokens. And so my belief is yes, I think they can use Jose and Jose for the JWTs and CWTs, but somebody else can correct me if I said that wrong.
I think that's true, but I think it's optional. I think they can be integrity only. And that's why this layer, it does, I think, matter.
So if we don't know any better, so I guess, Tiro, I don't know if you had a specific preference. Thank you, Ben, for confirming that we said it correctly. So if it's true that it's optional in EAT, then it might make sense to not constrain it here, to say if there's some use case where you don't care about confidentiality and you want to design a crypt cipher suite for that and you have a good enough reason, then giving that freedom to the IANA expert to allow it might be okay. So we could, because right now we don't constrain it, and we'd be explicit about us not constraining it, unless there's some reason to say, nope, sorry, and confidentiality only right now, and that's really the question.
Yeah. So I didn't realize I was on mute. So speaking from the RAT's perspective, we recall that there is a draft that speaks to the use cases in which no confidentiality is needed. It's the
UCCS?
Unprotected. Yes, the UCCS draft, right. So this is to say, I think the intent of EAT is that you would use, and that's where Jim Shad was providing the feedback, with the understanding that EAT, whether you were using the CWTs or the JWTs, that you would be using confidentiality in those tokens, which is why the UCCS draft was presented.
Okay, so I see a comment from Brendan that I agree with, and so I'm going to channel you with the mic here, Brendan. If you allow integrity without confidentiality, then there's a security consideration in doing that about, talking about how much it exposes personal information. And so if we go with the approach that says we're going to potentially allow this in the future, then we could introduce a constraint saying any registration that would actually propose that is responsible for, must discuss the whole PII issue and what fields are legal to be expressed in that in the Teep message or whatever. For example, is it only possible when you have EATs that do have encryption inside them, that type of stuff. And so we could have that type of a constraint that we put into our document that's actually requirements for those proposing an integrity without confidentiality cipher suite. I don't know if that answers your point, Brendan, but yeah, I agree with your point. So. Okay, +1. Thanks, Brendan, for confirming. All right, so I guess to make forward progress, let me just make a proposal here and see if there's objections to it. I guess the proposal is that we'll go ahead and do that in the next version, is that we will potentially allow future integrity without confidentiality, should there be requests for it, but introduce a requirement for anybody doing that to talk about the security considerations and how it protects things, or perhaps disallows the use in certain cases. So we'll try to take a shot at proposing some text like that for folks to review. So, all right. Unless there's any objections, then I'll take that as a direction, and then we can review it as it appears in the next document, in the document version. So, all right, let's move on. All right, so suit manifest examples. There's been an open issue that says, can we add a suit manifest example? And I think we had a simple one in the document. This is what we were talking about earlier in the suit discussion, the suit relationship discussion for hackathon. So the real question is whether the suit manifest examples for Teep should be in the Teep protocol spec or the suit manifest spec. And so this is not the first time this has been on the agenda, but I hope it's the last time that it's on the agenda for an IETF meeting. So just a recap as to where we're at right now, the suit manifest spec has 6 other examples in an appendix, okay? But it's close to being done, okay? That we don't want to keep the suit manifest spec, open for much longer. The suit meeting is coming up, I think, tomorrow, right? But the suit reports were pulled out into a different spec. And the suit manifest examples, it's useful to have both the suit manifest examples and suit report examples. So we talked about like error messages. If the suit manifest fails, then to say how you report that or how you report success in that example, okay? And so my proposal here is to put the examples of both manifest and report into the Teep spec. And that's because the suit report document is not done. We could put stuff in the suit report, but we'd have to bake it into the suit manifest, and we want them to match between suit manifest and suit report, and those two things are not going to RFC at the same time. Whereas if we put them into the Teep protocol spec, we can guarantee that all the latest stuff will be that they'll kind of match in terms of what's the latest stuff in the example. So here's some things that we would want in potential examples, maybe 2 of each. One is to install a TA that needs personalization data from another TAM. So you can show a dependency with two TAMs related. And the report, an example might be partial success, say where one of those succeeded, another one failed. Another example would be a manifest that removes or unlinks, to Brendan's point, removing a TA and its dependency, and the report might show full success. And so my proposal is we take those 2 examples with those 2 success and failure cases and add them into the Teep protocol spec, and we leave them out of suit, and we just ask suit to review them. So that's my proposal. Any objections to that? And I'm specifically looking at people like Brendan and Hannes and Russ, and if I hear no objections, we'll do that in the next version. So, all right. I'm not seeing anybody jumping in a queue, so let's go ahead and move on. Yeah, it makes sense to me. Thank you, Hannes. All right. Now we're getting into a section for a couple of related issues. It's about use of tokens in Teep that are interrelated issues around freshness and state matching and so on. So we talked about this last IETF a lot in the side meeting, not in the consensus-based meeting. So this is my report back out that summarizes some of the side meeting discussion, issues in the spec, and issues in implementation all rolled into one section here. So, all right. And thank you, sir, and I see your +1. All right, next slide. So let's get into this. A couple of related issues. So first, let's recap RAT's relationship. Okay. So we understand the context of some of these. So this is the slide that we've seen before in both Teep and RATs. And so the relationship between Teep and RATs is that the Teep agent is an attester. The TAM is a relying party. And you might have a verifier that the TAM uses on the back end. And so the evidence appears in the query response message. And then any remediation steps appear in the suit manifest, which is in an update message. Okay. So everybody's got the context here. Well, let's go ahead and move. So we're talking about the Teep message here, which is the horizontal line in the next couple of slides. So we're talking about evidence here and remediation steps in the update message. All right. So next slide. Okay. So in RAT's architecture, RAT cares about freshness and replay protection. So freshness means how recent were the values generated? How recent was that message generated? And replay protection is to replay an older one, even if it's within a very close period. Okay. And so the verifier versus the TAM is the relying party. So the verifier, the thing that might be separated from the TAM used on the back end, cares about 2 things. It cares about, was the evidence recently signed by the attester, right? That's the Teep agent. Was the evidence recently signed by the Teep agent, not an older replay of evidence from before something changed, like before it got the last update message, even if it was only 5 seconds ago. It might have been before the last update message. And so is the evidence recently signed. The second one is the claims in the evidence have some values in them. The values in the claims in the evidence are they recent values and not obsolete values that were included in recently signed evidence. Right? So those are the things that the verifier cares about. The relying party, which is the TAM cares about was the attestation result recently signed by the verifier, not an old replay, right? That's outside the scope of the Teep protocol itself, right? Because that's that vertical line. And are any values of claims recent, not obsolete values in recent results? Now, some of the claim values in the attestation result might have come copied or derived from values in the evidence, and so that's why it's indirectly dependent on what the verifier cares about. And so how recent things are is really up to policy, right? So the owner or the configurer of the verifier and the TAM get to decide what recent means, okay? And of course, the details of how it passes that information in protocols are how things are recent, right? What it uses to make that determination are up to the protocol. Well, there's three common ways, and we have a protocol where RATS doesn't. And so it's up to us to decide which of the three common ways we want to allow. So next. So I'm going to walk through the three common ways in the RATS architecture. So this is RATS architecture summary for Teep folks, because anybody designing a protocol needs to have a way of accomplishing those, and we have a protocol. So we are the customer here of RATS. So, all right. So the first mechanism we can use, and by the way, just as a to jump to a conclusion, we're currently using method 2, just to be clear. There's 3 methods. Method number, but the question is whether we want to stick with that or open it up to allow more than one. Right? That's where I'm going with this. Okay. So method number 1 is timestamps. And so we could allow evidence and attestation results, right? Not Teep messages, but evidence and attestation results that include timestamps. Okay. If you do that, this would be appropriate for cases where the TAM and the Teep agent have synchronized clocks, or at least roughly synchronized clocks. This requires that the Teep agent have a trusted source of time. Okay, that source of time might be a trusted clock internally or on demand, being able to look it up from an external trusted server. It requires some protocol that's secured to be able to acquire that time synchronization. So it might be, say, an implementation of NTP-SEC inside of a TEE for the Teep agent, whatever it is. It also requires having claims in the evidence about the signer's time sync mechanism, such as what's your time sync source, and is that something the verifier is going to claim is correct and trusted. But it doesn't require any additional messages or stated attestation time. So in particular, it does not require asking having the agent ask the TAM for a nonce or a challenge for the attestation, for the evidence. Okay. So you can get rid of an extra round trip here, which is why a lot of things are interested in doing timestamp stuff. But it's only applicable to cases that you have something like a secure clock on the agent. So it's not for everybody, but it can be a lot more efficient for cases where we already have this for some reason. So that's method number 1 is timestamps. So next slide. Method number 2 is the one that we're using now, which is nonces, are the ones that we already allow right now, which is the receiver, which in this case, the receiver of the Teep message would be the TAM, right? Requires the sender, being the agent, has to include a nonce in the signed evidence. And so the agent doesn't have to have any time sync. He doesn't have to have a secure clock in the TEE. But it does mean the TAM has to keep state. Whenever it generates a nonce or a token, right, it has to remember that state. And so if you have a very large number of agents per TAM, it can become a scalability issue that says how many agents can you support simultaneously doing message exchanges with, because you have to keep nonce state for every single one of them. At least in the classic implementation of nonces. Okay. And the TAM also needs a clock to know when to expire the nonces, although for most TAMs that's not really a big deal. And it doesn't have to be synced with anybody, it's just a local clock, right? How much time since week, that's fine. So that part for Teep is not a big deal. And then finally, this one only addresses freshness of the evidence. So how recently was it signed? It was signed since I sent you the nonce. This one does not address in any way knowing whether the values in the claims are recent. With the timestamps, you could include a timestamp inside the claim itself. You can't do that with nonces, not without introducing a hybrid, which uses nonces and timestamps together. So nonces alone only solve freshness of the evidence. It did not solve the ability to know whether the claim value itself was there. The RATS architecture does talk about ways to deal with that in the nonce case. Example, you could include how much, if you have a non-synchronized clock that is secure in the Teep agent, you could include time delta inside the evidence, and that can be used in a secure way. And you don't have to compare it with any time stamp, it's just time since, and if you can trust that. But that requires at least a clock, not necessarily a synchronized clock. And so that might not be applicable. So this is a partial solution with nonces. This is what we do now. Next slide. The third method. Yeah, right. That's to Michael. That's exactly what I'm getting to. Is yes. So hold it. I'll get there. All right. The third method is epic handles. Potentially, we'll call these epic IDs. This is a discussion in RATS. Epic PSKs. These are unpredictable values that the agent and the Teep both get periodically from potentially a third party. It's unpredictable, so you can't. So that's how you know that's recent, because you couldn't predict it in advance. They both get it from a trusted source, and it's just an ID that lasts during that epoch. And so you can include this in lieu of a nonce. And so you can do comparison that says, does it match the same one that I have? So this is much more scalable than a nonce in the sense of the TAM only has, say 2 of these, the current one plus the previous one. And all of the agents are using the same value during the same period. So let's say your epoch lasts, I don't know, 15 minutes or something. Every message sent within 15 minutes period can be using exactly the same epoch ID. Okay? So that's why it's a lot more scalable. Of course, you get a lot less resolution in how recent things are, because you can only say if something is recent based on the entire epoch. And so if your epoch ID, if your epoch period was, say, 24 hours, then you can only make a determination that the thing was sent sometime in the last 24 hours, right? And so you're up to the frequency of whatever the epoch ID distributor is. And so that's the only disadvantage here, is you lose some granularity, but what you gain is you gain the lot less state, and you still don't have an extra round trip to require the nonce. And so the point of these is that all 3 of these are, that no single one of these is strictly better than the others, right? There's always some metric in which one of the other methods is better, okay? And so what that means is that if we make a choice, we have to choose to either pick one, which is what we do right now. Right now we pick method 2, or we have to say we're going to potentially allow more than one choice in different implementations. So like what we did for crypto suites, right? We said you can have 2 of them that are mandatory to implement on the TAM, and the agent gets to pick, okay? And so that's really the question. If you go to on the next slide, please. Is no, okay, I stay on the previous one because I guess that this is a different issue. So let me just ask this: how? Okay, you go back to slide 16. So the question is, do we continue to stick with a nonce-only approach, okay, which does have the extra round trip and makes the TAM have to require a bunch of state and have scalability potential issues in some use cases? Or do we want to be more flexible and say that our protocol is capable of using multiple of these, in which case we might make a decision like we did for Cypher Suites that says 1 or more of these are mandatory on the TAM, and the agent can pick, or vice versa, or whatever. So again, in the hackathons, we've started to run into, gosh, it sure would be nice if the TAM was a lot less stateful than it is now. And you'll see that in comments from Ming and Ni and folks, where the nonce approach, by the way, when we say nonce in Teep, it also applies to tokens, right? So that's the issue here. And whether it's nonce if attestation is used, or token if attestation is not used, same thing. All right. So I guess my personal preference as an implementer is I would love to use maybe method number 3 as allowed. And of course, you'd have to have some way of doing capability negotiation like we do for Cypher Suites to say how you make sure that you're picking the same approach. But gosh, something like method number 3 would still allow use with constrained Teep agents that might not have secure clocks, but still allow scalability. And so if you were to allow both 2 and 3, for example, then the TAM can use epic handles for everybody that's, for cases that you don't care about strict recency requirements more strict than the handle distributor uses, and be able to fall back to nonces or something like that. So I guess I'm wondering if we want to open things up more than we are right now to make implementations better. So that's my question. I hope I just answered your question, Michael, about where I was going with this. Is to, should we change the Teep protocol to support a method other than 2, even if we retain also keeping method number 2 is allowed. So I'm especially interested in hearing from other implementers as to what they think, because in the Safer Suite analogy, right, we tried to keep the agent simple and putting the complexity on the TAM side by saying the agent gets to pick whichever one is the best for it, and the TAM had to do with the complexity of dealing with multiple choices. So, and Thomas said could make it a verifier problem rather than TAMs. So let me respond to Thomas. If we go back to that first diagram, Tiru, about that had the relationship between the picture, it actually applies to both. Make it a verifier problem rather than the TAMs. For the evidence, you are right, Thomas. For the attestation results, the TAM still has scalability issues there on the attestation results. So you're right, you could do something like make it the verifier's issue for scaling the attester, for scaling the evidence, and use a different approach in the attestation results. You could do something like that. But there's also case the same server or even the same implementation. And so it doesn't really solve the problem, Thomas, of scalability issues, right? Where handles and timestamps both solve scalability issues at the expense of requiring either synchronized clocks or less granularity. Isobi-san asks, can TAM work as a handle distributor? Absolutely. And again, I'm going to try to stop using the word handle because the RATS working group said we're not going to use the word handle. They're going to rename it. So I'm going to use Epic ID. I don't know what RATS is going to use, but that was one of like 4 terms that were thrown out there. And since here I say Epic handles, I'll call it Epic ID just for people to understand. Yeah, probably Epic identifier. Thanks, Michael. So can TAM work as a handle ID distributor? Absolutely. So all of the roles in the RATS architecture could be combined with other roles. They're conceptually separate. The handle, the Epic ID distributor could be the same as the TAM. It could be the same as the verifier. It could be a separate entity. Just like your time sync source, right? If you're using NTP-sec, your NTP server could be the same as your TAM, or could be the same as your verifier, combined in theory. So, but it's a conceptually separate implementation, even if it's combined into the same server or service. Okay. Any comments, preferences here? Because this one affects a lot of other stuff as to whether we allow more than just nonces. And again, when we say nonces, nonce/token in the Teep spec, a token is a nonce, not just for the non-attestation case, but all the same constraints apply. And these 3 approaches could be used without attestation. These 3 approaches here could be used in lieu of tokens. We could use Epic IDs in lieu of tokens in the Teep messages in theory. So, so not seeing anybody jump into queue, it sounds like nobody has a strong opinion at this point. So, yeah, the nonce was added in the Teep protocol to support the RATS case. All right. I have an opinion because I would love to get to a point to not have to do tokens in the first place for the main use cases that I care about. So. Hannah says, I think we should use whatever RATS does. Well, RATS is not going to make this choice. And the reason for that is RATS is not chartered through a protocol, and this is a protocol choice. The RATS architecture has to support multiple protocols. The RATS architecture has to explain how it could work with protocols to do any of these 3. And that's what it does right now. So RATS doesn't get to make this choice because RATS is disallowed by charter from doing protocol. So they're not going to solve this for us. They're not going to answer this for us. All right. So Daniel asked, which is the one that I prefer? right now, from talking to the people at, so I'm now going to put on a Microsoft hat, not as a document editor hat, because you're asking about which one I prefer. As a document editor, I prefer that one of the implementations prefer. And if different implementations prefer different ones, then I prefer supporting multiple of them. Okay. Now, if you ask me as an implementer or somebody representing an implementer, which one I prefer, I think when I chatted with people that own various Microsoft services, they kind of liked the idea, since they had not implemented the right stuff yet. The feedback was the method number 3 is actually quite attractive, they said, for cases related to Teep. And the reason for that is it does not have any strict requirements on having secure clocks, and it has the least state requirement given the lack of a secure clock requirement. So number 1 requires a secure clock. Number 2 has a state requirement. This one has neither. And so method number 3, the epoch IDs, they said was the most attractive, given that they had not implemented it yet. And so that's not a decision. That was that one looks pretty cool. We might consider doing that one. So I see Soren says the same thing. I prefer the epoch. So so I'd say between two implementers that like the epoch handle approach, that might be a consensus to at least allow epoch IDs. Whether we switch to that only, I guess, is a different question, but at least to allow it. Okay. All right, so I guess we can continue discussion on the list, but this one does affect a lot of other stuff. And so I see we got like 9 minutes left, but I think if we could get a direction on this one, this would make a lot of other stuff be more straightforward, because otherwise leaving this one open will leave a bunch of other issues open too. Yes, correct. That Brendan is correct. So I'm just going to echo that at the mic here. One of the issues, so the epoch IDs is not necessarily better than the other ones in all metrics. One was how much granularity you get in terms of recency, because your policy is limited by how frequently the epoch IDs are distributed. But the other one is called out in the RATS architecture document right now that Brendan does point out here, which is there's an attack that if you can cause the epoch IDs to be delayed in the network. Okay, so in other words, if I can somehow say DOS the epoch ID distributor such that the epoch IDs get distributed to the agent and the TAM, that new ones can't be distributed for 24 hours, then both the TAM and the agent continue to use the one that's 24 hours old. And so I can increase that replay window for as much as I can delay. Okay, and so that's the delay attack that it's susceptible to. And so, but that requires me basically delaying it on both sides, because otherwise you can detect the attack and mitigate it. But as long as you can delay it say by DOSing at the epoch ID distributor, then you can open that window to the attacker's wins. So that's the downside here. So that's why saying, well, let's just switch and only support epoch IDs. Some use cases might say I don't want that. And if we want Teep to be used in all use cases, then maybe one might consider supporting 2 or even all 3 of these methods in Teep, but that's more protocol complexity. So that's the trade-off. Yeah, so you're right. So method number 3 is not the best one from a security perspective, because you lose some security protections and granularity that you're getting out of the other 2. But again, it's all trade-offs, right? There's no single one-size-fits-all, and that's why this is a tough choice. So that's why if it's me as a spec writer, I might be inclined to have the spec support multiple methods for different use cases and let one side pick one so that you can keep supporting constrained nodes. All right, so I guess let's keep having the discussion in the chat and on the list, because it sounds like we're not going to be able to close this meeting, although I do see some support for the epic stuff. So let's keep going.
Yeah, so Dave, time check, there's 7 minutes left. Oh, yep. Okay, and Goran just went off the queue, so.
All right, gotcha. All right, so let's keep going. Well, let's take it to the list then, Nancy, is that right?
Yeah, I think we should.
Okay. All right, so we'll keep this one open, but you'll see that one will affect the next couple of issues too. And so let's see what else we can at least get out there to be part of that same discussion. So go on to the next slide. Okay. when the attestation bit is set, so the query request comes in, there's an attestation bit that says, hey, can you please include evidence in the query response? Okay. There's also a challenge field that's listed as optional that's in the query request. Okay. And so since it's listed as optional, you can see the text says when a challenge is provided, and the challenge in the request must be copied into the nonce claim found in the EAT. Okay. So that leaves open, so is it legal or illegal to send a query request which has attestation bit on and the challenge field absent? Okay, is that legal or illegal? That's the open question here. And so the first question, well, does Teep require the nonce approach, or is any of those approaches okay? Well, that was the question in this issue that I think Akira filed, and this one, any is okay. The intent of the text in the document right now is that the attestation bit was allowed to be set with the challenge absent. Okay, that was the intent when writing that text. Okay, now whether that's the right thing or not, that was the intent. So, but then the question is, how do you negotiate which freshness approach to use? I'm getting the blinking back again now. So, all right. So the evidence already carries the approach-specific claims. So if you use nonces or timestamps or maybe epoch IDs in the future, you can tell that by looking at the evidence, but you can't tell what's supported in the message. And so what we were just talking about is, should we force this is the relationship with the previous issue, right? Should we force the use of a single approach? Should we force the agent to support all? No, probably not. Should we add a field into the query request like we did for supported cipher suites, right? This is if we support multiple of them. That's bolded because that's the one that's my personal preference. Or we could overload the challenge field and make the challenge field mandatory by putting the stuff in there. And then the challenge field would become mandatory, but I don't like overloading fields. That's why I don't like that one. So, so if we support multiple ways of doing it, then my preference is that the challenge field would be optional. For example, if you have the timestamp approach, or the epoch ID approach, then you would not necessarily need the challenge present. And that would be a case where attestation would be set and challenge absent. Okay. And so this one's very closely related to the previous one. That if we go with one of those, then I think that the clarification is likely to be challenge, it can be absent. And that was the original intent, even though we recorded nonsense before. So, all right. Carry on unless I see someone jump into the queue. Next slide. And hopefully people can see why the other issue this one depends on. So let's go to slide 18. And Nancy, just call time. I don't know if we'll get to the last one or not, but you can feel free to call time. And
no, I think this, depending on how quickly you've got 2.5 minutes left.
Okay,
yep.
Great. Use of a token versus a challenge. And so this one, there was a response, I think, already on the list, or maybe in the chat here. And so you can see we have a token field and we have a challenge field. Now, at the time that this was written, the token and the challenge are both exactly the same syntax. I think that has now been fixed because I think the challenge is now increased to 512 bytes in order to work with that SGX thing that Akira mentioned in the hackathon report. So both of them are B stars, and so the intent was the token is present if and only if the attestation bit is clear, and the challenge is allowed but not required if the attestation bit is set. So you could never have token and challenge be present at the same time. So given they could not be present at the same time, they currently have separate label values and should we combine them into one label? And I think there was a response from someone in the list, I don't remember who, maybe Ben, who said better to keep them as separate because they're semantically different. And so I think that is the proposed resolution to 127, which is to just clarify, to just leave them as separate things and make sure that it is clarified. So unless anybody has objections to that, we'll leave them as separate things, even if they have the same syntax, which they currently don't. So that one should be easy. I guess we can go on to the next slide. Maybe we can get one more in 2 minutes. So, all right. Last one is related to that question about epoch IDs and whether the challenge is required. So this one has been open forever, and I'm coming back to it now because we're now getting to the tail end of things. And so I want to kick this into that same discussion we take to the list. So I'll just tee it off right now and ask people to comment in the list discussion of the other one, the epoch ID related one. Unsolicited query response. Okay, well, if you're using attestation with timestamps or epoch IDs, then you don't need any per request token or nonce, right? You're actually not keeping any state because that was the point of making sure there's no state in the TAM. in order to generate the stuff. You don't need to get a challenge. There's actually no reason to get an extra round trip because there's no state to match, right? You're trying to not have state, right? And so the proposed optimization is that if a query request contains no token or challenge, then the agent may cache the information in that query request and send any unsolicited query responses in the future to that same TAM URI whenever it's handling a request TA or unrequest TA API call from the broker. But anytime, periodically, so the request policy check API is a periodic one from the broker, that one shall always generate a query request. And that's to detect changes to the TAM. So you're caching the stuff, but your cache is refreshed at the periodic rate, but it doesn't recur an extra round trip on demand right when you want to install something. That happens offline in the background at the request policy check interval. So that, I believe, gives the ability to respond to changes on both sides while reducing the extra round trip. So if we go that approach, that is my proposal here, and we're out of time now. So if you object to that, you have to take it to the list. But that I would like comments on the list is that proposed optimization, which I think works fine and gives the best behavior. So there you go. That's what I would like to do in an implementation.
Perfect.
Okay. Thanks, Nancy.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I think we're out of time. Dave, you only had one left. So my suggestion, since we are out of time, is to put these last two, the previous one and this one, on the list.
Yeah.
And
sure.
We should be able to close them down.
Sure.
All right. All right. Good progress. Thank you, everyone. And we'll continue the discussion, especially on the different methods for keeping freshness on the list as well. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.